clinical care rounds focused on EMS patient care and operations. I'm John Kramer. I'm an emergency and EMS physician. I'm the director of the National Office of EMS, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and I'm the team lead for the HHS Healthcare Resiliency Working Group, EMS Pre-Hospital Team. I'm also the EMS Medical Director for the Caroline County, Maryland Department of Emergency Services. The purpose of these sessions is peer-to-peer real-time sharing of COVID-19 EMS challenges and successes. In developing these sessions, our guiding principle is, if I'm preparing my EMS system for COVID-19 patients, the clinicians I want to learn from are those who have the most experience. This is a voluntary public-private collaboration. Thanks to the multiple professional organizations that have collaborated in this series. It is not intended to be redundant or replace any organization's initiatives. It is intended to be sharing of clinical experience, not recommendations or guidance. These ECHO clinical rounds you are now participating in are focused on healthcare providers sharing their successes and challenges with other healthcare providers. Special thanks to Project ECHO, Dr. Bruce Struminger, Amanda Dazan, Amy Armistead, and their team for the peer-to-peer learning platform we're using for these rounds. Upcoming ECHO 19 clinical rounds currently are all US noon Eastern time. Monday devoted to EMS, Tuesday critical care, and Thursday emergency department. It's self-evident that our nation's medical response challenges are changing every day. We'll continue to work to identify topics for these peer-to-peer learning rounds that are most timely and helpful to clinicians. For each clinical rounds, we continue to have participants from many states and multiple countries, predominantly physicians, nurses, and EMS clinicians. Special appreciation to NETEC, the National Emerging Special Pathogen Training and Education Center, for their support with these rounds. These ECHO clinical rounds and NETEC's webinars are complementary to each other. We continue to receive many questions for each of these rounds and apologize in advance if we're not able to answer all of them. We select major themes from the questions received and hope to cover some of those during each session. We'll also be doing crowdsourcing and polling questions with results shown in real time so that we all have the opportunity to learn together. I'd now like to turn it over to Dr. Struminger to review some of the logistics and other background information. Bruce?
Thank you, John, and welcome to our presenters today, to our expert panelists, and particularly to the almost 200 participants who have taken time out to join us today. Just want to go over a couple of logistical and housekeeping topics. As a reminder, we love getting your questions and comments, so please put those in the Q&A feature along the bottom of the Zoom toolbar to the right. If you have any IT or logistical questions or issues, please put those in the chat feature. We'll be monitoring both and try to get to as many of the questions and help you out with any logistic IT issues. We are recording today's session, and your attendance is consent to be recorded. Thank you. The recording will be shared in a couple of days through our website and along with the presentations. And hopefully those presentations also were linked to the announcement that went out this morning. So we'll be sharing a link to the HHS ASPR Clinical Rounds website, and there's an archive of all the past 80+ recordings and PowerPoints from our series. For those interested in CME and continuing professional development credits, they're being offered through the University of New Mexico, where Project ECHO is based. We'll be sharing a link to the survey, which then will give you access to instant electronic CME about 15 minutes before the end of today's session. There should also be a link in the announcement that went out today from Project ECHO. You'll have up to 48 hours to complete the survey and claim that CPD credit. Just as a reminder, these learning sessions are focused on improving patient care and health systems and supporting clinicians. Please let's keep them apolitical and non-commercial. Thank you for that. A word about your data when you register, when you answer the polling questions. You're sharing a variety of data with us. We just want to ensure you all that we take data stewardship very seriously, and what data is shared with HHS ASPR is all de-identified. As John said, NETEC, the National Emerging Special Pathogens Training and Education Center, is a partner in this education initiative. They have their own education and training series. This week, there'll be a webinar on COVID-19 and acute renal failure on Wednesday, and this Friday on care transitions to home health. So we recommend that you sign up for those if you can and attend real time. They also have an archive of all the recordings. Additionally, the AAMC is a partner, and we want to recommend and encourage you to check out their rich clinical guidance repository. They keep this updated regularly, and you can access that through the link here. John, back to you for the crowdsourcing question.
Thank you, Bruce. Okay, so throughout the course of our conversation today, please address this crowdsourcing question. For my EMS agency, currently, the biggest challenge that my agency is facing regarding use of PPE, my apologies, I misread it. What is the biggest challenge that my agency is facing regarding the use of PPE in the context of environmental considerations, which is one of the big issues that we'll be talking about in today's session. When you respond, please indicate the country or area of the United States from which you are responding. I'd now like to introduce a veteran of these ECHO EMS sessions and someone who's joining us for the first time today. Dr. Alex Isikoff is a professor of emergency medicine at Emory University School of Medicine in Atlanta. He is the director of the section of pre-hospital and disaster medicine, and is also the executive director of the Emory Office of Critical Event Preparedness and Response, referred to as CPAR. He's also the medical director for the Emory Grady EMS Biosafety Transport Program. Dr. Isikoff is the lead for the National Emerging Special Pathogens Training and Education Center, and is a designated subject matter expert for ASPR tracing, with whom he led the development of the EMS infectious disease playbook. Dr. Isikoff received his medical degree from the University of Pittsburgh and an MPH from Brown University. He completed his residency training at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center, EMS fellowship with Boston EMS. Is certified by the American Board of Emergency Medicine in both emergency medicine and emergency medical services, and is a member of the EMS subboard for ABEM. Ben Tizer has over 17 years experience in fire and emergency medical services. He's a member of the Omaha Fire and Rescue High Consequence Infectious Disease Transport Team, and was instrumental in the transport of patients with confirmed Ebola virus disease who were cared for at the Nebraska Biocontainment Unit. He enjoys working with other EMS agencies in developing their infectious disease transport programs. Outside of work, for the limited time that he has available because of everything that he does, he enjoys traveling with his family and keeping up with his 2 young sons. It's my pleasure now to welcome Dr. Isikoff. Alex.
Thanks, John, and thanks to everyone joining. It's always great to get together with this group. I am going to work to put up my slide deck here. Don't get alarmed by the number of slides that you're seeing. We're going to move through this very quickly because I think it's important actually that maybe we address some of these points, but more importantly, get to questions and maybe some dialogue with the panel. The topic for today, John, as you've already introduced, is really about personal protective equipment and keeping the healthcare personnel, the EMS workforce, safe in the context of COVID-19. And in educational programming that we've done with NETEC and through other channels, and I'm really happy to share the podium here with Ben Tizer, who's really a great colleague from Omaha Fire in Omaha, Nebraska, who's also worked with me to deliver some of these education and training programs. Everything that we know about implementation, use of PPE for COVID-19, really for any communicable disease, is based in what we understand about standard and transmission-based precautions. We'll come back to the standard and transmission-based precautions. It's really the bedrock of everything that we do to keep our workforce safe when we're managing patients that are potentially harboring a communicable disease, COVID-19 included. And I don't think anybody on this call has to be told that as frontline healthcare workers, we're at risk for contracting illness. We saw that in the SARS outbreak epidemic in 2003, where a large proportion of healthcare personnel were the ones that were getting sick because of unrecognized exposure to patients with SARS. And we're seeing again, no one on this call has to be told, but it's nice to be able to quantify it, that we're at risk as frontline healthcare workers for contracting COVID-19. This was a study that was done both the UK and the US. Actually, there were more people enrolled in this study in the UK, and this was done early. You can see March, April 2020. They enrolled like 2.8 million people, far fewer in the US, that were healthcare personnel, and then got them to basically self-report if they developed a COVID positive test. I remember back in the spring, it was a lot easier for healthcare personnel to get a COVID test at all because testing was not that widely available. So they had to make an adjustment for that. But even after adjusting for the likelihood of having access to a test, there was a threefold increase in the likelihood that you would convert or become COVID positive if you're a frontline healthcare worker. And I think another important sort of factor here to consider is if you self-reported, I mean, it's a limitation of the study, but if you self-reported that you had inadequate access to PPE, then your likelihood of testing positive for COVID increased to like almost sixfold. And then they also looked at if you self-reported reuse of PPE. You know what that is? I'm going to use a face shield and often disinfect it and put it back on, reuse it because I don't have another one to get if I throw this one away. Same might be true of use of an N95 respirator. That also resulted in increased likelihood of frontline healthcare worker, popping positive for COVID. Now, what's really important for me to state in making this statement is that this was before official disinfection procedures were actually in place, meaning that today you can go to a number of resources, NETEC website included, and find ways to recycle your PPE, put it through a disinfection process, so that it can be reused by use of, for example, aerosolized hydrogen peroxide or chlorine dioxide or some other disinfectant. So this study preceded those protocols. But again, I think it's important for us to be able to quantify that as frontline healthcare workers, we're at risk for increased likelihood of COVID just because of the work that we do. Doesn't mean that PPE doesn't work. It just means that we have a greater risk as compared with the general population of becoming COVID positive. And another thing that informed the need for PPE, appropriate use of PPE, is also a study here done actually by colleagues at the University of Nebraska that looked at aerosol and surface contamination. So aerosol generation and surface contamination. They had an opportunity to study this early in the pandemic because at a national quarantine and isolation center that they managed there, they were able to do environmental samples in these rooms where they had COVID positive people that were under isolation, and they found positive, or by use of an RT-PCR, which is a test to look for strands of SARS-CoV-2 molecule. They found that they could recover the virus from a lot of places where you'd expect the virus would be, like on handrails, in a bed, cell phone, remote controls, on the toilet. But even in places like under the bed, or preponderance of droplets like near a ventilation, sort of air return, even being able to find positive samples from the air, 63% of samples in the air were positive. Samples taken just outside the rooms in the hallways, over half of them were positive. What it suggests is that, something that we've come to understand now already, there's great risk for transmission of SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, through direct contact with people, direct contact with their infectious sputum, through direct contact with their heavy droplets. But we've also come to recognize that that suspended droplet nuclei, or close range aerosol transmission, is also a possibility. Now I'm going to make a distinction between that and long range airborne transmission, something that we are maybe more familiar with, like in how measles is transmitted, or TB. There's no evidence to suggest that that's a major contributor to SARS-CoV-2 transmission. But suspended droplet nuclei, or aerosols, close range to the patient, certainly can be a risk. And then the virus can sort of persist on surfaces too. You've probably seen some of these studies, stainless steel, 48 to 72 hours, plastics, these impermeable surfaces. Unless it's copper, because copper is germicidal, these droplets can persist in the environment, on the handrails of your EMS stretcher in the back of your ambulance. And so it's critically important that we have PPE to protect ourselves from those fomites. Again, primary way that you're going to transmit COVID-19 is person to person, but there's some risk also that you're going to get it from an environmental surface and put it in your nose or your mouth and get infected. Here's the last slide on just risk, this is a nice graphic that came from American College of Emergency Physicians COVID-19 field guide, and it kind of gives some idea about aerosol dispersion, based on different types of interventions that you've also heard reported are aerosol generating. So CPAP and BiPAP kind of at the top of the list, but a non-rebreather mask much lower, high flow nasal cannula much lower. But here, these aerosol producing procedures obviously creating risk for us as healthcare personnel too. So standard and transmission based precautions, we know what these standard precautions are. It's the hand washing, it's application of any PPE, a piece of equipment to protect you from exposure to infectious droplets. It's also, the sharps management and OC health. All these things are, standard precautions, the cleaning and disinfection of environmental surfaces. And then the transmission-based precautions also inform our PPE selection. So contact precautions typically require a gown as a part of the PPE ensemble to protect you from contracting an illness, and also giving it to another patient because some part of your uniform is contaminated. So for PPE anyway, contact includes gown. For droplet, it would be a face mask, and then of course a mask on the patient and the standoff distance. And then for airborne transmission or aerosol, put the mask on the patient for source control. But now we need a fit-tested N95 respirator, fit-tested NIOSH-approved N95 respirator, as part of the PPE ensemble. And so this is how you get to what's the PPE requirements for COVID-19 because of our understanding about how this respiratory illness is transmitted. It requires implementation of standard precautions, plus contact, which is the gown, plus airborne, which is the N95 respirator. And then because none of those actually always include eye protection, the eye protection gets added as well. So standard plus contact plus airborne plus eye protection. And this is the preferred PPE ensemble, as we know, for managing patients with COVID-19. And you'll see there's an acceptable alternative if an N95 respirator is not available, and that's the use of a face mask, still with a face shield or goggles, still with a gown and gloves. But if you have a patient that is highly suspected to have COVID-19 or confirmed to have COVID-19, certainly if you're going to perform an aerosol producing procedure in a patient where you expect they might have COVID-19, then that fit tested NIOSH approved N95 respirator is a really key, component of that PPE ensemble. You've already seen, some of the slides demonstrating that you can have suspended droplet nuclei in and around the patient, and aerosol producing procedures will increase that likelihood. A couple other, slides before I turn it over to my friend Ben. You talk about source control. We got to put a face mask, on the patient. Don't burn your beautiful, and very valuable N95 respirator by putting that on the patient. A surgical mask on the patient would be great. Even their own face covering is useful at preventing transmission from person to person. And this is just one study that demonstrated among 246 participants that were infected with some kind of respiratory pathogen, rhinovirus, coronavirus, or influenza virus, half wearing masks and half not, that there was a significant reduction in positive droplets and aerosol samples for those for those samples among patients with coronavirus and influenza. That actually in this particular study didn't pan out for RSV, but this study just supports the importance of face covering on the patient as a means of source control and decreasing likelihood of transmission. And then, the $1 million question here is, thanks, Dr. Isikoff, for letting us know again that this requires an N95 respirator or better, face shield, gown, and gloves. But what happens when those pieces of the PPE ensemble are in short supply? And that's a huge challenge for all EMS agencies. Probably your supply chain varies depending on your location, demands for those resources at various times based on COVID transmission in your community. But you've got to have some kind of strategy for optimizing that PPE supply. And in the 5 minutes that I have, it's hard to get into that in any great detail. If you Google optimize PPE supply, CDC, actually you'll find a pretty expansive approach to how you can implement extended use procedures or reuse procedures. Specifically for an N95 respirator, you can find guidance on disinfection for reuse of those N95 respirators. You can find guidance on alternative respirators that may not be approved for healthcare workplace, but and wouldn't be the preferred approach to respiratory protection from an airborne transmissible disease, but could be used if you're in kind of a contingency or crisis standard modes as it relates to your PPE supply. Eye protection, gown conservation, that guidance is there as well. Here's really maybe the one principle that I think is critical in any PPE extended use or reuse. And that is that depending on what you're doing with patients and what kind of procedures you might be performing on them, obviously this PPE is doing its job. It's protecting your eyes, your nose, your mouth, your skin from exposure to the virus, and that means it's probably getting contaminated to some extent. And so the real risk to us as EMS providers in the field, healthcare personnel in general, is that when we hope to reuse a piece of PPE, what you do is you risk contaminating yourself in just the doffing of that PPE, the need then to disinfect your hands, the reuse of that PPE, for the next patient, and donning that piece of equipment again in a way that doesn't, end up letting you get the virus in your eyes, nose, or mouth. And so we got to be really careful if we're going to reuse PPE, for example, between patients, that we have a procedure in place that helps, prevent the chance of getting contaminated in the process, accidentally getting the virus into your eyes, nose, or mouth, and then developing disease. Here's a last slide that I just wanted to share because another question that's come up, especially over the hot weather months, is how important is the gown? Because gowns are kind of hard to get your hands on, and gowns are just more uncomfortable in hot, humid environments. And questions came up about how important it was to use a gown at all, and what evidence there might be for interrupting transmission with respiratory viruses. And this Cochrane database systematic review While it didn't address SARS-CoV-2 or coronavirus in general, it did provide some evidence at interrupting transmission of other respiratory viruses like RSV, for example, through use of gowns. They, through this analysis, meta-analysis of a number of studies, they found that gown wearing was effective at interrupting transmission of respiratory virus. This is all in the in-hospital setting, though. You have to, we're always extrapolating or often extrapolating the experience in the in-hospital setting to, to our procedures in out-of-hospital setting. But gown wearing was effective at interrupting respiratory viral pathogens, and all means combined, meaning hand washing, masks, gloves, and gowns, achieved a very high level of effectiveness. So even the gown here, is important in addition to the face shield for eye protection, the gloves, of course, and the fit-tested N95 NIOSH approved respirator. The last thing I'll say before turning it over to my colleague Ben Tizer is that the PPE is just one part of the equation, as we all know. We are working to implement a hierarchy of controls to prevent transmission of disease, and in that hierarchy, actually, while the safety equipment like the PPE is very important, work practices, like the right work practices, the right administrative policies, the right environmental controls are as effective or arguably more effective than the safety equipment itself. The PPE is very important, but having those policies and procedures in place, trying to augment the environment to decrease the likelihood of exposure of healthcare personnel to pathogens, in such a way that the PPE is necessary to prevent transmission is critically important. And so I'm going to actually stop there, and I'm going to look for questions in the chat, and look forward to hearing Ben's comments that will complement mine, I'm sure. Thanks, everybody, for the invitation.
Thanks very much, Alex. While we're transitioning the slides over, quick question specifically based on some of your comments that came in the chat. Do you have a perspective on the use of KN95s as an alternative to face masks when N95s are not available?
Yeah, good question, John. The first thing I would say is, the official recommendation, right, for a respirator that's going to afford a healthcare worker, like a paramedic, EMT, pre-hospital provider, protection is going to be a NIOSH approved N95 respirator or better, one that the healthcare worker has been fit tested for. If you can't access a NIOSH approved N95 respirator, or an N99 or an N100, something else, if you don't have access to anything else, and you have the option of wearing a KN95, in my estimation, this is not an official position, in my estimation, the KN95 will afford you better protection than the no N95 respirator at all. And so that's my position. I don't know if that's the official, CDC position on the value of KN95 masks. The preferred piece of equipment is clearly a NIOSH approved fit tested N95 respirator or better. But would I reach for a KN95 if I didn't have access to an N95 respirator and I needed to care for a patient I was worried had COVID-19, especially if I was going to perform a aerosol producing procedure? Yeah, I probably would, but I'd like to hear what the other panelists have to say about that too.
Yeah, we'll circle back to that for the panel discussion. Thanks, Alex. Ben.
Yes.
Please join us.
Okay. In my slideshow, can you see the title slide there okay?
We can. You're up.
Excellent. Good morning, everybody, or afternoon, depending upon where you are. Thanks for the nice introduction and the invitation to speak here. I was asked to talk about some cold weather operations in regards to PPE use and also touch on some COVID-specific items with EMS. While COVID is still relatively new to us, PPE in the wintertime cold elements and the challenges that go with it are certainly not new to EMS. We've been dealing with cold fingers and cheeks for years, but I hope to share some things that might help responders stay warm, yet maintain the needed level of protection while taking care of patients this day and age. Now, I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that in most scenarios, EMS is outside the confines of an ambulance, a patient's house, or a hospital, really for minimal amounts of time. It's usually just enough time to get that cold air blast in your face to take your breath away, or pour enough rain on your N95 mask to make it unusable. But there's also times we're forced to be outside for longer periods of time, such as during vehicle extrications or event standbys at structure fires or various other times. These obviously require a different consideration for appropriate PPE. It's important not to talk in terms of getting cold, because cold is more than just a temperature. It includes additional environmental elements such as humidity and wind speed, as well as worker variables and physical activity, things like that. So while people do not get cold, they do lose heat, the heat that is generated based on their body's physical activity and metabolism. So that's why a person standing on a street corner 15 degrees below zero waiting for a bus feels much colder than a person jogging past that same street corner. Physical activity causes the body to generate more thermal energy, resulting in higher body heat. And when we're working in a cold environment, workers lose heat and their body temperature drops. And often, despite our best efforts, workers become less safe when they are cold. I suggest we always have cold weather gear with you in the ambulance. I like to keep a small duffel bag that includes a windproof, water-resistant pants, similar to snow pants, a long-sleeve sweatshirt, and an extra pair of socks and footwear to serve as a backup in case my boots get dirty or wet. I keep a stocking hat and heavy gloves in my bag as well. And I've actually started to keep some lightweight cotton gloves in there too, some cheap ones that you can get at the hardware store in bulk. And I'll talk more about those later. Now, it's important to remember that cold weather PPE does not generate heat. It simply insulates the wearer and keeps the heat in that body is producing. But I'd like to focus on the importance of appropriate clothing under your PPE. According to the CDC website regarding cold weather layering, they suggest that you wear several layers of loose-fitting clothing. The inner layer closest to your body, they suggest that you wear a fabric such as wool or silk that doesn't absorb moisture. And then the next is an insulation layer that helps retain heat by trapping air close to your body, thus keeping you feeling warmer. Items that are made of natural fibers such as wool or fleece are very effective for this. And then that outer layer that helps you protect from the wind, rain, and the snow. You want to remove extra layers when you start to feel warm, because excess sweating will cause you to lose more heat. You want to stay dry and always remove wet clothing if you get it wet, because that can quickly chill the body. Now, how do we approach the patient safety regarding this? It's actually easier than you think. While responding, blasting that ambulance heater on high on the way to the call is the first step to maintaining this patient comfort. Like Dr. Isikoff said, controlling your environmental factors is probably going to be highly effective. Closing the doors quickly once you get your equipment and your stretcher out, not opening both doors at the same time on the side and in the back of the ambulance, and putting an additional blanket between the stretcher pad and under the sheet might help. You never want to assume the patient is quote unquote too warm in the back of your ambulance. Complications with patient body temperatures have far-reaching effects, anywhere from trauma patients getting cold or to the elderly who might not be able to shiver, to pediatrics who can't really regulate their own body temperature. So remember, the temp in the back of the ambulance is not designed to keep you as a responder comfortable. It's all about keeping your patient comfortable. And in fact, it'll probably result in making you warmer or more uncomfortable than you need to be. We also know that the virus tends to spread a little easier in cold, dry environments. Some studies have shown that environments with low humidity and cooler temperatures allow for a virus to spread more easily by way of droplet or aerosols than in warm and more humid environments. Our bodies also seem to accept these viral particles easier, as our mucous membranes in our airway passages and tissues that trap to mitigate those viruses tend to be drier and less effective at doing this in the cold, dry environments. But we know that simply applying a surgical mask on the patient, like Dr. Isikoff said, or having them do it themselves before we approach them, greatly reduces the spread of the virus from the source. And again, controlling the environmental factors and trying to eliminate the spread will be the most effective method. PPE that you and I actually wear is really our last line of defense. Contrary to most people thinking that that's the first and foremost line of defense, you need to employ those other work practices that were discussed earlier. As some evidence, there's 2 case reports that suggest masking a patient prevents transmission in higher risk scenarios. In one case, a man on an airplane flew from China to Toronto and subsequently tested positive for COVID-19. He had a dry cough, but wore a mask on the entire flight. The 25 people closest to him during contact tracing revealed that nobody had tested positive for COVID-19. In another case in late May, 2 hairstylists in Missouri had close contact with 140 clients. While sick with COVID-19, everyone was wearing a mask and none of the clients tested positive. You've seen this image before, but I'm going to talk a little bit different reason for it. Now, our specific PPE needs shouldn't change because it's cold. So if your SOPs or protocol says you need to wear an N95 and gloves on every patient encounter, then you still need to wear it. These just lay out the minimum that you need to wear either on calls or based on the signs and symptoms that your patient is exhibiting. It might be a determination factor up to the EMS provider. The CDC is specific on their preferred PPE for COVID-19 protection, which you see here and have heard about earlier. But what they don't address is what can be worn underneath them. We talked a little bit about it earlier, but one thing you can do is be prepared by dressing in layers. It's easier to take a layer off prior to donning your PPE than to wish you had it after you had it on. Now, there are a few challenges, skin coverings on the face being one of them. The N95 or surgical mask only covers so much. You can see in that picture, there's a lot of skin exposed on your face, your cheeks, your neck, that the elements can really attack. Now, I've seen some products out there that incorporate a type of a wrap around neck covering with a face mask, essentially being a dual purpose face and nose mask and a body warmer. But these really are not N95 masks. And I'm not sure that there's an N95 type mask out there that covers more than just the mouth and the nose, obviously due to requirements for fit testing and the effectiveness concerns. Now, weather is another concern for PPE. If you're using aprons, those disposable plastic ones are probably most effective at protecting the EMS responder from the rain and snow as it wicks off the moisture versus the ones that potentially could absorb the moisture. But it's, again, important that the layering underneath is adequate because that plastic gown provides absolutely no thermal protection. Make sure you take the time to have your partner or yourself tie the gown and secure it appropriately so any wind won't compromise the protective effectiveness. Goggles versus a face shield is also a decision that needs to be made. The CDC says face shield or goggles. You need to figure out what works best for you. I see most responders actually prefer to wear goggles with an N95 mask, which works well most of the time, aside from that fogging issue that nobody can seem to have a magical solution for. If it rains, though, you really need to take special care that your N95 mask does not get wet. So in this case, maybe a full face shield, as in this picture, in lieu of goggles might be reasonable in these situations that'll actually cover down past your chin. Now, gloves is another consideration. Now, there's an agency in my area who provides those thin cotton gloves to be utilized in their PPE complement as another option for outside prolonged operations, such as fighter rehab at a large scene. While the cotton gloves themselves don't really provide any type of fluid protection, they do provide some thermal protection. So their process is they put a nitrile glove on their hand first, and then over that they put the cotton glove and then another thin nitrile layer on the outside of their cotton glove. Now, there's no official guidance over this, and this is not necessarily to be taken and used as gospel to anybody, but it does work for things such as taking blood pressures of firefighters who are coming out for rehab on a fire scene or doing documentation where you have to be outside, but may come in contact with a quote unquote patient. Any deeper interventions that you're going to be doing, such as starting an IV, performing any invasive airway, is probably going to be done in the back of an ambulance where you aren't going to need these 3 layers of glove and you can go back to your basic level of PPE that your agency uses. Another agency has responders specific to lifting and moving. Maybe a fire truck responds on your 911 call with you, or there's vehicle extrication or stretcher lifting. These personnel actually wear thicker rubber gloves. An example is, as you can be seen in the picture, similar to a hazmat type glove. They can be properly disinfected and reused based on their composition of the material. They're really not a feasible option for detailed patient care, such as starting IVs, though. That's what the EMS crew typically does with their normal gloves. For interfacility transports where rain and snow might not be a big factor, it's just cold, maybe a cotton or polyester brand reusable gown might be appropriate, like you see on the right side there. Some agencies have actually purchased the same gowns that their hospital system uses and has made an agreement with the hospital system that they just use them in the exchange program, much like many agencies use for sheets and blankets. They leave their dirty ones there after they drop the patient off to launder, and they just grab a new one off the shelf or a clean one off the shelf. And then the last thing on special PPE use in winter that I wanted to mention is regarding PAPR hood use. Some agencies still use the hooded PAPR for their suspected or confirmed COVID transfers. I just wanted to remind you to make sure that the hood is properly secured before going out into the elements. The photo you see on the left here is from an exercise that Omaha Fire participated in on a windy, cold day. This is in the middle of an airport tarmac, but you can apply it anywhere. You can see the hood was constantly flapping up into the medic's face, causing him to reach up and constantly touch his face to bring it back down, which is not a great practice. So just make sure that's secured to your suit. And the last slide here, the last thing I wanted to touch on was preserving or reusing an N95 mask. This is very agency specific and driven by your infection control people, your public health people, and the other appropriate regulatory authorities that have a hand in this. Many agencies have policies in place regarding this N95 mask reuse. They range from using the same mask for an entire shift, maybe it's just a single patient use, or a combination of. Or maybe they wear that N95 mask until they have a confirmed COVID positive transport, or have to be around a patient who's not able to imply a face covering for some reason, such as an invasive oral tracheal intubation or things like that. Whatever it is, make sure there's a policy in place to make sense to your agency. As far as N95 mask protection, we talked earlier about using a face shield to cover that mask in wet elements so that N95 doesn't get wet. Some agencies actually they put a simple face mask over their N95 as a way to preserve that. But I want you to know that a surgical mask or cloth covering over an N95 is not approved or recommended by NIOSH because it's not consistent with the conditions that mask went through to get approved to be an N95 functioning mask. So therefore avoids the certification of that. The CDC actually recommends a cleanable face shield over your N95 instead. And I also want to remind you that N95 masks should be discarded if they get wet, damaged, or soiled due to rain or snow. Another component of mask protection is proper storage. So hanging that mask from the rearview mirror with a theory that the sun's UV light will clean it, it's not really a good one. A better practice would be to store that mask in a breathable paper bag in between uses if you're able to take it off and reuse it in between patient encounters. And if you do have a cleaning and reuse policy, make sure that process is appropriate and in line with manufacturer recommendation and CDC guidance. I put a few links on here to websites covering various topics and guidance for PPE use. Just always verify the source when you're getting your information to make sure it's from a reputable source. Well, thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you today. I appreciate the invitation from Dr. Kramer and to present a little bit about this PPE and cold weather use, and I will turn it back over to you.
Thanks very much, Ben. Great points and some wonderful ideas for consideration. We're going to transition over to polling questions and get those taken care of, and then come back to the panel for further discussion activities. With our polling questions today, we're doing, we will come to the regular series of polling questions in just a minute, but we're doing some special polling questions for the sessions this week. Rick, I'll turn it over to you for those, please.
Yeah, thanks, John. As those of you who have participated before, Dr. Kramer and I tag team these rounds for EMS, and appreciate him turning this one over to me for just a few minutes. Some really brief background. Participants have been great with the polling, and we get just tons of information collectively. I mean, you get it, we all see it. And that in addition to the chat, the QA, I mean, we're all learning together. One of the things that's a sort of a persistent looming question is the so what thing. Are these making any difference? And indeed, you know, so you see people are still showing up. So it's like, and by the way, the pandemic hasn't disappeared. So yeah, there's that. But we're also trying to get a feel for, we really are at a point in time where it's important to get a pulse check on the rounds themselves. We've done 84, this is the 84th clinical rounds that we've done with over 35,000 participants from all states, and I believe over 100 countries have participated. But like, then there's the so what piece. So we've designed and gotten through IRB, circles, et cetera, 4 questions that we will ask of you as participants for EMS rounds, but we'll also ask the same questions for critical care rounds tomorrow and the emergency department rounds on Thursday. So we get sort of a broad cross section of our participants. So there are 2 our tradition as clinical rounds, polling questions with the traditional sort of polling responses. And then there's also some qualitative questions. The qualitative questions I'm going to be asking Project Echo, Amanda, to help me run through with you, because it's going to require a little bit of flip of screens on your part, and we'll need your extraordinary adaptability as EMS clinicians to be able to wade through that in a timely fashion and still get the responses that we're looking for. We will de-identify these as we have for previous polling. So what you say, we're not looking for the individual responses, we're looking for the collective. So Amanda, can you, I'm assuming that we're gonna start with the quantitative ones, yes? Ah, yeah, there we go. So you all see it up, I believe. The polling question is, in the event of a future national or local emergency, would you join echo calls again? And it's a Likert scale. It's pretty straightforward. This one's a Likert scale, and then the next one's a Likert scale too. Amanda, is there a way to tell the numbers of people who have responded on these? Amanda, you might be on mute. Ah, okay, bottom corner. All right. All right, I'll wait just a few more seconds on this one.
I just also want to let everybody know that I put a link in the chat and you can also find it at the top of the screen, and that's how you respond. There's also a way to do it via text, but that's a little more complicated. So we recommend just clicking that link in the chat.
I firmly believe, as I think probably many of you do, it's really important to find bright spots these days. And I got to tell you, this one made me smile. Looks like we need to start planning the 100th episode gala. All right, just a few more seconds and we'll stop. It's like... All right, let's stop there. Thank you. And hopefully everybody can see the results or saw the results. Do you believe that the information provided by echo calls has helped you provide better care to your patients? And then after we get through this one, Amanda, I'm just going to need you to walk them through how to get to the qualitative ones, because that's a little bit, yeah, it's a little bit trickier. And I've already submitted my teaching portfolio. I'm all done with that. So this is not for my teaching portfolio for promotion, promise you. A few more seconds. All right, let's stop there. Thank you very much. If you can leave it for just a second so people can see. And then, Amanda, I'm going to turn it over to you, the coach participants through on the how we go through this one.
Sure. So it'll actually be using the exact same link that's in the chat that you used previously. If you still have it up, it should either refresh or it'll refresh itself to bring up this question. The main difference is that with this one, instead of just selecting a response, it's going to give you an option to type in the whole thing. Well, the responses will show up on the screen. They're all de-identified, so we won't know who is saying it. So just a heads up on that. And then if you did opt to use the text one, you will have to enter your entire response before sending it instead of just a letter. I'm going to guess that responses for this one will take a little bit longer to come in as people type them out.
Dr. Strominger and I just communicated, we aren't looking for just like the results from this particular day's training, but all the ones that you've seen in the past as well. I apologize for not clarifying that on the front end.
And just as a note in regards to that, participants in this can respond more than once. So if you do have more than one thing, please feel free to send in multiple responses.
Thanks for everybody like participating as fast as you are. It's really helpful. And then there's one more after this, and then I'll turn it back over to John. Amanda, I think we'll do like another 30 seconds. That's a 10-page essay. Amanda, I don't know about the process for 10-page essay submissions. Wow.
If there is a limit to the number of characters you can have in your response, I'm unaware of it. So feel free to type as much of it as you can in this time.
All right, another 5 seconds. I really appreciate everybody like jumping on these. It's great. All right, let's stop there. And then the next question, is very specific to operational practices, okay? So last one we did was on clinical. This is around what specific operational practices have you changed or implemented as a result of this training? And as you recall, for those of you who participated before, we spent a lot of energy on both actual individual patient care and also operations itself. Yeah, and to clarify again, the result of this training is really this series of trainings, not just today's, okay? All right, Amanda, let's stop here in the next 10 seconds or so. All right, let's stop there. And thanks very much, everyone. You know, it was a great effort on everybody's behalf to try to like adapt to like inserting something a little bit new for us. Actually, it is brand new, but it really helps us figure out like direction of where we go from here. So thank you very much all. I'm going to turn this back over to John.
Thanks, Rick. Appreciate that. And thank you all for contributing those answers. And for the other answers that were also included in the chat, we're saving those and we'll have those for future reference as well. The polling questions that we were going to do today were have been asked at previous sessions, and we were going to use those as sort of a longitudinal following activities. But in view of the hour, I want to make sure that we have time for the panelists to provide any follow-up questions to our presenters or thoughts or perspectives on the information that was presented today. So if you have something, please raise your hand when you come on, introduce yourself very quickly, and we'll spend a little bit of time with the panelists. Any questions or comments? Dan, we'll start with you, please.
A great presentation today. Thank you very much. I'm Dan Gerard. I'm the president-elect for the International EMS Chiefs Association. I just wanted to say, you know, supply chains are tenuous at best. You know, we're getting hit hard in that regard. And especially in, just to give you an example, gloves have gone from $5 to $7 a box to $19 to $22 a box. So that's been a big hit for us. You know, mask droplets and aerosols. I've learned so much about droplet and aerosol transmission of disease over the last 6 months than I think that I have over a 35-year career in this business. You know, our biggest challenge are those KN95 masks. Early on, Department of Justice and FDA told us that, you know, large quantities of them were counterfeit. And so, you know, to use them as kind of like a last line of defense, I think many agencies are sort of flexing that up. And then just to touch on reuse and decon, you know, the decontamination of masks, while there have been a lot of different methodologies to decon of masks, you know, we still kind of struggle with the concept of the filtering capability and the protection that they're able to provide after they've been deconned. And with all the different methodologies there, I don't know if that's really been quantified for us as a profession, whether, you know, we're getting the same levels of protection. But again, great presentation by everybody today, and thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Carol?
Yeah, I had a quick question for Alex and Ben. Great presentations. Similar to what happened back when HIV was discovered and everybody started wearing gloves, we saw a surge in latex allergies. We're starting to actually see that in the mask, just with the I don't know if it's the polymers in the mask or whatever, more people being more sensitive to it or having allergies, perhaps partially during the prolonged periods of time of wear, more so in the emergency department because you have it on the whole shift versus in EMS. And I was just wondering if the CDC or if you had recommendations for potential alternative avenues for PPE, or maybe this will be an opportunity for technology to develop some type of alternative compound or mask that'll offer equal protection. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the question, Carol. I mean, I think it's something that really needs to be studied more carefully, right? I mean, the anecdotes are important to kind of raise awareness. There probably needs to be a better sort of epidemiology exposure study to see if it's really, you know, creating a problem. I don't know enough about the textiles per se to see if there's a, you know, a better material that could afford the same protections as an NIOSH-approved N95 respirator. Clearly, a PAPR would avoid the problem, right? But PAPRs are largely impractical and less available, and certainly more expensive, than an N95 respirator or an N99 or an N100. So good question, but don't have a great answer.
Thanks, Alex. Doug, did you have a question or comment?
So one of the questions in the box intrigued me a little bit. They asked about, how you avoid getting outerwear during the winter months contaminated with all of the issues with gowns. And certainly that's an issue. I think for most of the gowns that we're using, if you go out into inclement weather when the wind's blowing and, snow and that sort of thing, the gown's going to be flying and wrapping up around you and what have you. But the point that I made was, I think one of the things we have to do is realize the gowns are important, but we shouldn't trust them 100%. And we should assume that, we are not totally encapsulated. You have exposed neck, you have pant legs, you might have something under the gown that blows up. So the way I would view it is that, we should be viewing ourselves as always contaminated, being very careful about touching the face and washing the hands frequently. And then at the end of shifts, crews should be removing clothing and either laundering it at the station or laundering it as soon as you get home and showering as soon as you get home so that you're going home in fresh clothing and not taking this into your car and wherever. And I think if we just view this as part of the fact that the gowns may help, but it's not 100%. And even with good gowns, we need to realize that this could be on your neck or anywhere else and you need to shower after the shift and change clothes and things.
Great. Thanks very much, Doug. Appreciate that. Other questions or comments from panelists? Rob?
Hi, yes, I'm Rob McClintock. I'm the Deputy Director of Fire and EMS Operations with the International Association of Firefighters. I have a question for Dr. Isikoff, just to get his thoughts and maybe his opinion. CDC has recently updated their close contact guidance. So in particular around the fire station or in the ambulances, when you're in contact with one of your coworkers who've contracted COVID, it says now that the close contact is cumulative, 15 minutes over a 24-hour period of time, regardless if you're wearing a cloth mask or a surgical mask. They recommend going into quarantine for the 14 days. Of course, that could have some serious impact on our staffing levels. So I was just curious as to what your thoughts might be, Doc.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you described the update and the close contact definition, quite well. It's obviously, more people will qualify as close contacts now, not just in the fire station, but in the general population. I understand the logic behind it, but at the same time, implementing that, operationalizing it, even community-wide, is going to take tremendous amount of resources, and most communities are struggling to do good contact tracing. To get to your specific question, I think what you've said is right, that considering somebody a close contact, then testing them, having them quarantine or stay away from the station for 14 days is going to have significant impact on this critical infrastructure, the workforce that's provided by those firefighters and EMS professionals in those stations. And so what I expect is it's more likely that agencies are going to adopt the critical infrastructure guidance, the same guidance that healthcare systems are using today, which is they'll identify their close contacts. They may actually even have a testing strategy for their close contacts. They'll advise the close contacts that if they come to work, they should always wear a face covering or face mask, even if they don't have any signs and symptoms of illness. Right. And they're going to, continue to monitor them very carefully for the development of signs and symptoms through that 14-day quarantine period. But I think that's likely the most sustainable way to do it. You could try to send people home on quarantine, but I think like you've described, it's going to very quickly impact the ability to conduct operations. And I think converting to that sort of, healthcare system approach, critical infrastructure approach to management of close contacts is the way to go.
Thanks, Alex. David Tan.
Thank you very much, John. I just wanted to say thank you to both speakers. Again, just an excellent presentation. I wanted to get Dr. Isaacov's take on going back to his discussion on the infectivity and fomites. When you talk about the ability to detect SARS-CoV-2 on various fomites, whatever it might be, what is your sense on its relationship to infectivity? In other words, I'm trying to think here when we start talking about EMS crews being with the patient for 15 to 20 minutes, and there's, barring any large inoculum contaminating their clothing, how worried do they have to be about sitting at the fire station or the ambulance station afterwards if they didn't do any aerosol generating procedures and they don't have a large inoculum on their clothing?
That's a great question,
I don't
David.
think infectivity is the same thing as being able to detect it. And I just wanted to see what your thoughts on that were.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that. So, that paper that I described that was demonstrating, where you could recover a viral fragment. First, to emphasize your point, those samples then weren't cultured to see if they were replicating virus, right? They just demonstrated that virus was there, might be dead, but that they could recover it. The real point of that was that they found some of those, particles of virus like under the bed and in places where you shouldn't have been able to just do a direct shot, which was supporting the notion that you're having some kind of, fine droplet nuclei, some type of aerosol sort of, movement of that virus. But you're right. The fact that you can get a positive environmental sample is not the same as infectiousness. It doesn't suggest that it's a replicating virus. And I will say, as a general principle, the risk from fomites is not zero, but it's a much greater risk of transmitting COVID-19 from person to person, right? Direct contact with their, respiratory secretions, direct contact with their heavy droplets or exposure to their heavy droplets in real time. There's got to be some fomite risk, but it's not as great as that person-to-person transmission risk. So, David, your point is well taken and it's correct in my estimation.
Thank you. We have time for one final question or comment from a panelist. Anybody? David Gerstner.
So regarding the extended recommendation about what a contact is from CDC, Ohio's health department has been using a version of that that's actually more stringent than 15 minutes cumulative over a 24-hour period. And we've been encouraging in public safety, not just fire and EMS, but also law enforcement, mask use in stations, in cruisers, in engines, and not cloth masks, but actual FDA certified PPE, meaning surgical masks or procedural masks. And according to CDC guidelines, if you have 15 minutes close contact, but you're wearing PPE and know how to do so, that doesn't constitute a contact. So I agree with Dr. Isaacov that we do have the critical infrastructure capability to say, yes, people who are in quarantine can work, but it's obviously far from ideal. We've tried to avoid the need for quarantine by using PPE, not just on runs, but all the time, except when people can go off to their separate areas, which we also encourage throughout the day. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Hey, John, one other comment. We talked in one of the polling questions about the value of these rounds. I've been participating in a series of United Nations webinars that don't attract anything like the audience of the Echo rounds. And you and Rick and Bruce and Amy and Amanda have done an absolutely amazing job. And the value of these is shown by the continuing audience that you get week after week after week. these are serving a really beneficial need, and I appreciate all the effort you guys put into these.
Thanks, David. Bruce will send you your check later.
Okay, make it a good one.
As Rick has alluded to on previous calls, we could keep going for another hour and a half with this valuable discussion. However, everybody has other things that they need to do to continue our response to this event. I want to thank Alex and Ben immensely for your presentations today. Thank you to the panelists. Bruce, thank you. Amy, Amanda, and your entire team. And to the audience, again, the quality of the responses that you had put in both today in the chat and to the special questions that we've done today demonstrate your knowledge, your interest, and your commitment. And we thank you for helping us with all of these sessions. Having said that, have a great day. We hope to see you all next week on these rounds, and tomorrow or Thursday or both on critical care and emergency department rounds. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.